Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with Michael McCullough. Michael is a professor of psychology and the director of the Evolution and Human Behavior Laboratory at the University of California in San Diego. He's an experimental psychologist, and he has been concerned with the evolutionary and cognitive underpinnings of human prosociality. He has studied forgiveness, revenge, gratitude, empathy, and prosocial behavior. He's the author of more than 150 scientific papers, which have appeared in some of the top journals in psychology, such as the Journal of Personality and Social Psych. And he is a fellow of the APA, American Psychological Association, and the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. He is the author of his most recent book entitled The Kindness of Strangers, How a Selfish Ape Invented a New Moral Code. And as we say in the conversation, just won a pretty prestigious award. So it's an award-winning book, and it's a fantastic one. And I read it shortly after it came out, and then I reread it again right before a conversation, and he's someone that I've been wanting to talk to for a long time, and I was very, very happy to finally get him on the podcast and talk to him about his research. And so we spent about almost 2 hours talking about the book and his research, and so we just had an absolute blast. The first 15 minutes or so of the conversation, we talk about his background, and sometimes when I'm doing conversations, people come on, they, want to talk about their book or they want to talk about their research. And sometimes I feel like the biography of the person gets missed. And so that's kind of where the conversation led. And I thought it was super helpful and really kind of inspiring hearing his background, kind of his journey, where he landed. And it was just really, really nice to kind of put more of the person with the kind of the scientist and the researcher. So that's where we start the conversation, and then we start talking about why he wrote the book, his newest book, and how we can understand kindness and cooperation. We talk about his 4 instincts for care that he mentions, and that's a big running theme throughout the book. We talk about reciprocity and some of the challenges with reciprocity. We talk about judgments, intentions, and character. We discuss the taxonomy of emotions, such as compassion and empathy. We talk about many features of empathy, the downsides of empathy, some of the prosocial aspects. We talk about the axial age and the development of the golden rule. We talk about humanitarianism in the modern age. And towards the end of the conversation, we talk about effective altruism and the future of compassion and kindness for humans. Again, Michael is one of the nicest people I've ever talked to. He is genuinely and authentically very, very nice. He's brilliant. He's a really good scientist. And you can tell he has a really big passion for his research and what he's studying. In some parts of the conversation, it's, somewhat of an interview, I guess you could say. But, I'd say majority of the conversation was just that. It was a conversation. We kind of wrestle with some ideas, what is, some of the problems with empathy, or how do we understand, study of emotions, or, how do we understand the intentions of someone's character? And it really was conversational in that way. And I like when, some of my guests are able to kind of do that, because there's some fluidity to it, and it feels more conversational, and but we're talking about some really important stuff. So it's less interview, I would say, in some parts. Some parts it is, and more conversational. And Michael's just such a wonderful guy to do that with. And so now I bring you Michael McCullough. I'm here with Michael McCullough. Michael, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've been wanting to talk to you for some time about your fantastic book, so I'm very, very grateful and excited to talk with you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So this book was put out last year, right? The Kindness of Strangers?
June of 2020.
Oh, so we're 22 now. So I guess a year and a half ago is when it came out. The book is Kindness of Strangers: How a Selfish Ape Invented a New Moral Code. It's really brilliant. I've read it twice now, and it's very, very good. So we can talk all about that. But before we do, congrats! I saw you post that you won an award for this book. I have that right?
Yeah. The Society for Personality and Social Psychology, SPSP, awarded it their book award for 2021, and I guess I'll get the award in 2022.
Yeah, no, congrats. I mean, that's a big award, and I mean, people just want to get a book published and people to read it, much less getting awards for it. So, I mean, it's a big congrats to you. It's all your hard work paying off there.
It was a really nice surprise. It meant a lot to me, actually. I won't lie. I was really, really happy to see that people had read the book and in my discipline and, thought something of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will get all into it, but before we do, just tell listeners who you are and what you do and what you research and all that wonderful stuff.
Sure. I am a psychologist, a social psychologist, evolutionary psychologist, experimental psychologist. I answer to some intersection of those names. Mm-hmm. I've been doing research for decades on moral sentiments, moral emotions, the emotions and motivations that undergird our social lives, particularly our pro-social lives, when we're doing things for other people, cooperating with them, helping them, assisting them, aiding them in times of need. So a lot of it's been about the emotions and motivations that drive pro-social behavior. I have another line of work that's been ongoing about religion and religion's consequences for, a number of things. It used to be health and well-being, mental illness, psychological well-being. But more and more, it's been about behavior and also cooperative behavior and moral judgments. So I've got this line of stuff on pro-social behavior and this line of stuff on religion and morality. And those have been kind of my two home bases research-wise.
Yeah, no, those are fun topics to study. Difficult in some ways because I think some of them can be abstract, but I think fun topics to study. How did you just kind of briefly get into that? I mean, people when they come out and they come out of grad school and they've done a dissertation and they're trying to find their way in research or whatever. Sometimes people just fall into things or they take the long route. Or was that kind of the plan from the beginning, or you just kind of stumbled your way into it and have just been there? Or how did you kind of get into these areas of research?
I was interested in religion and in moral virtues when I was trying to make my decisions about where to go for graduate school.
Oh, wow. Nice.
I was really interested in how people forgive. And I was interested in particular on the role of religion in mental health, and also how we could take people's religion more seriously when we do counseling and psychotherapy. Something you might not know about me, there's no reason why you would know it about me, is I actually, my PhD's in counseling psychology. So I went to graduate school expecting and hoping that one day I would see patients, working as a clinician out in the world. And I was pretty interested at that point in the ways in which people's religious convictions might cause them to shy away from psychotherapy, or ways that misunderstanding people's religious beliefs could lead you astray when you're trying to diagnose their issues. So I was really interested in kind of the integration of religion as sort of an individual difference variable that clinicians ought to take seriously in the counseling process. I was also interested in the possibility that religion could be a resource for mental health and well-being. So I was kind of working on that stuff. I'd read a lot of it as an undergraduate, and I found an advisor who that's kind of what his whole deal was, integrating religion into psychotherapy and taking clients' beliefs seriously. And the other thing he was interested in was forgiveness. And so the way this guy works as a graduate advisor is, and I've confirmed this with some of his previous students and the ones that followed me, is, his name's Everett Worthington.
This name sounds familiar.
He's written about 1 million books.
Yeah, the name rings a bell. It rings a bell.
Yeah, he's written about 1 bazillion books. And honestly, it's dozens of books at this point on forgiveness and counseling. Done a lot on marriage counseling, religion and counseling. But the way he works with his advisees is he says, look, here's what I'm good at. Here's what I'm interested in. Find something in here to muck around with that will be something for you and something for me, something that we'll both be enthusiastic about. And that's definitely what he did with me. And I said, well, where should I start? And he said, well, here are some papers I've written recently, have a look and see what you think would be, an interesting opportunity for you to explore. So this was back in the days when if you wanted to give people a copy of a paper that you'd written, you actually had to give them a physical copy.
Right. No PDFs. Physical copy, right?
No, there were physical copies, and he had a closet in his office with a bunch of shelves, and all of his recent papers were sort of stacked on these shelves. It was like his reprint closet. And so he'd go and pull the reprints off. And, it was actually cheaper back then to buy reprints from the publisher, like bound. They looked like little pamphlets,
wow,
bound edges, than sometimes to go to the photocopier yourself. I'm really dating myself here, but oh well, I'm really not 70. I'm south of 70 still, but and south of 60. Yeah, that's how it was. So you go home with the reprints or the photocopies, and that's kind of how you dig into stuff. But anyway, he'd written some things on religion and counseling, and then on forgiveness that I really was interested in, and so that's how I started exploring that stuff. And then it was really just reinforcement learning. I got rewarded by finding that this stuff could be published in good places. There seemed to be other people who were curious about what forgiveness is and how you measure it and what the causes of it are and the consequences and how you might facilitate forgiveness experimentally or through interventions. So there was just it was interesting to me. It had, I thought, important potential real world consequences. It can be a big bad world with people who harm us and people we harm. So it seemed to have a real world relevance, and there was just not a lot we knew about it in psychology. So it was an easy thing to stick with because
there's not a lot. When there's a void of research that hasn't been done, it's like, well, I'll just kind of stay here and keep figuring this out. No one else is doing it. I definitely can hear that. I didn't know all that. That's very interesting. It is very interesting. I have all of these other questions which I won't ask just because I'll stay on track here. But I will say that we have some overlap. So my first master's was in counseling, and I went to a seminary, a religious background.
Where'd you go? Can I ask?
Yeah. I went to a school called Capital Bible Seminary. It's out here on the East Coast. They used to call it Dallas on the East Coast. Dallas Theological Seminary is
right,
the big school in Dallas, Texas. And so it was,
Baptist. That's a Baptist Theological Seminary, right? In Dallas.
Yeah. Oh yes. And so I went there and I graduated from there. And so I have a background in counseling, and then I switched to clinical psych, and I personally left religion and have been I've been an apostate since in 2000, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's interesting, and I remember in certain places we would talk about religiosity and talk about spirituality and talk about the different components. Of course, I went to a pretty reformed school, and many folks were fundamentalists. So, but reformed in the sense of exegesis and hermeneutics, and really there was a kind of, you almost got a double major. You did the professional counseling, but then you did a bunch of other electives and credits in theology. So and it's an experience I'm proud of. I don't use directly some of the stuff from seminary in terms of theological stuff, but it is a very helpful perspective. Of my my story is very interesting in that way. I feel like I've lived multiple lives in some ways,
Yeah.
But yeah, I started out with counseling, and I did enjoy it, and but moved to clinical psych, and there's a little bit more of a wider lens and wider opportunity to do things with clinical psych in some ways. So the clinical aspect helps with that. So, but yes, it's very interesting how you moved from counseling psych to some of the research end of things. And so I didn't know that. That's an interesting kind of lens on it. So it was funny how the world takes us.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, this was a very research intensive counseling psychology program. It was a PhD granting APA accredited counseling program in a department of psychology. So I would have been able to go do any of the stuff counseling psychologists do, or the stuff that clinical psychologists do.
Oh, that's great.
But it was research. It was really research intensive. So, I mean, what happened with me is I went from doing the kinds of research that counseling psychologists do, which is largely about measurement and assessment and psychometrics. They really tend to be pretty good at that. And doing work on interventions, evaluating interventions. And what really happened was I just found myself spending more and more time in the lab and or at the typewriter, at the computer. The typewriters died even before I was in graduate school. So yeah, it wasn't at a typewriter. It was a computer. A lot of time at the computer keyboard or in the lab, and less time, in the consulting room, in the counseling room. So, and my work got more and more about measurement of psychological constructs more broadly, and laboratory experiments looking at more fundamental components of forgiveness or religious belief or whatnot. So I just was becoming more and more of a researcher, as a primary identity feature, and less as a clinician. So it was pretty natural. It was just kind of, gradually spending more time in the basement.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how certain things will pull you that way, and then you find your way into a certain area, and it's sometimes you have to kind of very actively say, I want to do something different, and it's interesting how life is that way. I mean, there was a period where I worked clinically with kids and adolescents, and that is not my forte. I just kind of fell into it, and I did it for a while, and I don't even think I'm like the best at it, but I always, feedback I got was people really liked my work there, and I nominally enjoyed it, but that's not what I got into this field to do. And so I did it for a while, and then I had to actually say, okay, I want to work with adults, and I want to work in inpatient, and I want to work, and I had to kind of actively do that. It's interesting how certain things would just kind of pull us in certain directions, even if we don't recognize it. So it's kind of by happenstance kind of happens. The book, and so I guess to segue into this is, you don't have to give me a long answer, but why did you write The Kindness of Strangers? And compassion and kindness are kind of like big topics in the book. And so how do you kind of define them, and why do you decide to write on them, and how do we understand that in humans?
Sure. Well, I got into the evolutionary psychology racket in a way of thinking about psychology back in the early 2000s because I just thought this is a really comprehensive way of thinking about psychology, starting with the assumption, well-founded assumption, that our minds were designed by natural selection. And there were certain things we were really, really good at doing as, evolved creatures. And I wanted to turn that lens toward thinking about the stuff that I do, like forgiveness. That my first single authored book was called Beyond Revenge, The Evolution of the Forgiveness Instinct. Mm-hmm. So, and it was really just, exactly what it sounds like. It was an evolutionary psychology treatment of our capacity to forgive. So, I've been in this pro-social behavior racket for quite some time. And even before I had thought much about evolutionary psychology, really. But when I started to try to understand what evolutionary scientists were writing about and thinking about when they wrote about pro-social behavior, I found some arguments being tendered in the literature that made it sound like people had evolved to be naturally concerned about the welfare of complete strangers, as if we had in fact positively evolved we had evolved cognitive systems that positively are for taking an interest in the welfare of people you don't know. Mm-hmm. And that didn't sit well with me. That didn't seem like the kind of stuff natural selection would be very hospitable to. I couldn't think of any good reasons why an evolving creature would get repaid for taking an interest in the welfare of strangers, other than because these are opportunities to garner favors for yourself down the road. I could see that.
Right.
But the notion that we care deeply and abidingly, consistently for the welfare of people who will never be able to do anything for us in the future, that struck me as being, I just didn't really hold water for me. So I wanted to figure out if there really was good evidence for this idea. And so a lot of the book is about explaining why I think many evolutionary treatments of humans penchant for the kindness of, for taking an interest in the welfare of strangers, where I think those models fall a bit short, but then also trying to explain the obvious, which is that we do care about the welfare of strangers. People do take an interest in their welfare, obviously. Mm-hmm. So if we didn't evolve for it, how is it that we're doing it? Like, how do we manage to do something that we're not evolved for? So that was the puzzle that sent me off wanting to write this book. I mean, it's kind of a book with, maybe it's two books in a single book, and that the first, third of the book is making this negative case. It's basically denying that we have evolved instincts for the purpose of benefiting complete strangers. And then the second 2/3 of the book, I suppose, is a more affirmative case for explaining, how it is that we came to do what we are doing, which is mm-hmm. taking an interest in the welfare of strangers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it does, the book kind of does fit into 2 or 3 parts of sorts of this kind of, groundwork on the evolutionary constructs of how that works. And then there's sort of a kind of historical element and kind of in the modern day stuff of how we have so much humanitarian aid and all these things. And so it is a very interesting and complicated, I think, history. I'm going to ask about, because these are the 4 key things. So I'm going to ask about the 4 key points and then kind of ask a follow-up to that. So the 4 key points, you call them these, and I think it's just straight out of Darwin, these 4 instincts for care that are rooted in kind of Darwin's model, which the way you describe it is reciprocity, and that harkens us back to Trevor's work on reciprocity, status, incentives, and reason, and I think you kind of split those even between the two. The first 2 are one kind of subcategory, and the second 2 are second category. And that makes sense. And there's a lot of overlap here on many folks that are looking at this. I was talking to somebody before we were going to have this conversation, and I said, a lot of, in the more recent years, I'd say in the past 3, 4, 5 years, there's been more work within psychology and biology and many other disciplines on cooperation. We're very interested more recently in if we're these, selfish apes and we're, self-centered, and people talk about, different aspects of narcissism, but even if you look at all the biology of us and, selfish gene, things like that, there's so many things about how we're terrible to each other and how we're very selfish and all these things, but that's not always the case. And so many people have been looking at, well, how do we cooperate? And then why? The why is always the hardest question. So, the book came out last year. Nicola Rehani, she wrote The Social Instinct. It's very good. It's a very good book. And her, whole premise and her research is how we evolved cooperation to help us in the world. This is a lot of folks have been writing about this, but from slightly different angles. And so, I'm not sure if you've read her book or read some of her research, but her, she kind of does a kind of a 4-part as well, right? Which is consistent, which is basically, how, yes, genes are selfish, but all genes work together within an organism, within a human body. So there's a cooperation there, even at that level. Okay. And kind of outward layer. How does that work with families? Kind of discusses kin selection, etc. Then she goes out further with that makes kind of sense, ourselves, our bodies, how we function with family, with, relatives, people we know. But then what about other humans? And so there she discusses concepts such as interdependence, status, altruism, reciprocity, and then further out into kind of the uniqueness of what makes that human. Because you can see other animals that are doing these types of things. Her background is in biology. She works with the psychology department over there in I think it's University College in London. But she, that's her background, and so she works there. But the uniqueness of humanity is that we have coalitions. We have this emphasis on fairness, social competence, and then darker sides of cooperation, how we could have people cooperate to do nefarious intentions. And this is a kind of byproduct of that. And so I say all that to say a lot of people are talking about cooperation, and I just given an example of her work. And so how did you get to these 4 instincts for care, and how do you make sense of kind of this, structure of reciprocity, status, incentives, and reason for understanding cooperation and kindness?
Yeah. So what interested me the most is not explaining. In some ways, I was interested in not explaining most of the cooperation in the world, because most of it is not what I'm talking about. I mean, most of the cooperation. Well, first of all, so when evolutionary biologists talk about cooperation, what are they talking about? They're talking about behaviors or instincts, if you like, that drive the behaviors. That cause you to pay costs in order to provide benefits to another individual, and that evolved at least in part because of those effects on others. Mm-hmm. So it's stuff you do that benefits others, that evolved at least in part because it has those effects. Well, most of the behavior that qualifies for that is behavior we direct toward our kin. My God, what percentage of my good I'm doing for other people in the world is being directed toward my first degree relatives? Like, it's almost all of it. Right. Yeah. And so that's really well explained. The evolution of those instincts has been really very well explained. Well, actually going back nearly 100 years, but made famous, made memorable, made popular in the 1960s. So that's a big chunk. I mean, we might want to, you could call that like 2/3 of the help, of the helping in the world. And then the other, large chunk really is about the exchange of favors, the exchange, generating benefit, generating grateful beneficiaries, doing things for others that will cause them to want to do things in the future for you when you have a need. So reciprocity is really well-worn stuff. So if you've got those two explanatory devices in your tool belt as a scientist who studies cooperation, we evolved to care for those who are our genetic relatives, and we evolved to care for and the people our genetic relatives care about, and we evolved to care about people who might be in a position in the future to repay our kindness. Then what you're really left with is, why would we help people that have to whom we're unrelated, and really are very, very unlikely to be in a position to help us in the future. And we know that. We know they're very unlikely to be able to help us in the future. So that takes me away from thinking that the kinship explanation, based on relatedness, is going to do much work. And for the most part, I think an explanation based on the notion that we evolved for reciprocal helping is going to be limited as well. So that leaves you with what? If you're trying to explain why we, might take an interest in the welfare of children in sub-Saharan Africa who are dying of malaria every year, like why do we care? Like why would that be something that goes in, in our ears, information about that, or through our eyes, and then something happens in the brain, and then suddenly you're reaching for your checkbook or your credit card. Like what does that appeal to? What's turning on your hand to write that check or to type in that credit card number? So what is it? So I think we're looking for evolved mechanisms. We're looking for features of the mind that take that information in and do something cool with it. So I don't think it's like, it's like, oh gosh, we must think that they're our genetic relatives, so I'm going to treat them like kin, treat them like my daughter, my son. It's probably not, wow, here's an opportunity for me to rack up a favor with someone who's going to take an interest in me, because they're not going to know you were the donor. You're just contributing money to a pot that will go be used to buy and distribute mosquito nets, mosquito bed nets or something. So what could you get? What kind of mechanisms might be grinding away in the head that would explain this behavior? And what I concluded is that, as you say, reciprocity, the desire for favors in the future in a very limited sense, the desire for glory, being admired, respected, and the benefits that brings, and then our ability to track our incentives and reason our way to courses of action that will help us to fulfill those incentives. Now I've talked a long time, so maybe I should throw back to you and unpack each of those.
Well, yeah, I would say a few things when you were explaining that is, on the reciprocity piece, it seems, there's been a lot of ink spilled on this now at this point, since the 70s. And my understanding of reciprocity is that it becomes very effective on a one-to-one basis, right? So, you and I, we're friends, and I tell you, okay, we're going to go and we're going to get lunch. Okay, I got you this time. Don't worry about it. It's on me. Cool. And maybe I do that 2 or 3 times in a row, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be this kind of, one-to-one kind of thing. And then, we got another time and you get it and it's fine. And it's kind of it's a balanced of sorts relation. There's a reciprocal thing. I do something for you, you do something for me. Okay. That makes sense in a one-to-one relationship. Where I think reciprocity breaks down is that you can't scale that as well, right? You cannot scale, one person does something for a group and they're just kind of falling on the sword all the time for something. So reciprocity just breaks down. So I think that's where you do have various symbols or elements of status, right? I'm going to do something and that's going to be representative of my intentions or my value system or, how I care about a fellow human. And that's incentivizing. I mean, and depending on which context you're in, right? And depending on the aspect of having an audience. Now, you could do something nice for someone and have no viewership, right? And that's fine. But there are, I think, long term, you tell me what you think about this. Long term, though, there's a point where it says, I want to do certain things because we do want the recognition. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be a bad thing is one thing. The last thing I'll bring in here is obviously there's interdependence and coalitions. I think those things scale up, and that's what we need. We need things to scale for humans and communities at the very least. And then also, you can really scale this in terms of nations and how they help and all that stuff. But I do think this is something that I think I brought up with Nicola when I talked to her, was we had this kind of slight disagreement on altruism. And I still don't know, if I remember correctly, her point was like, well, it was a technical thing, but I always have not really believed in kind of this pure altruism. Someone's always getting something out of it. And I think the answer she gave was something along the lines of that, inclusive fitness is some type of indirect benefit. And so that there's this element where we don't know that something's happening. We don't know we might not get something, but we're still going to do that thing or whatever. And it's an interesting kind of pivot there. But altruism is another big thing, right, in terms of status, which is, well, I'm doing this out of the kindness of my heart, and I'm not getting anything in return, but, you might get the accolade, or you might get the acknowledgement, or you might get the really nice thank you or something like that. And there is a kind of reward for that, I think. And so I don't know how purely altruistic it is, but so anyways, just tell me about what you think about in terms of reciprocity on the one-to-one kind of relationship, scaling that in terms of interdependence and coalitions and, status, and then the ideas you have about altruism there. Sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think reciprocity has been important historically. I mean, if we're looking at the scope of the kindness of strangers, the scope I'm taking in the book is what happened over the past 12,000 years, basically, to where we've gotten to where we are now, which is, we have UNICEF, we have Oxfam, we have the effective altruism movement, and we have complicated welfare states. We have, et cetera, food stamps, Social Security. Where do these institutions come from? So that's the kind of game I was stalking in the book. And I think reciprocity has been important over that 12,000 year period, not in the sense that you are actually trying to necessarily create grateful individual beneficiaries, as much as trying to curry the favor of possible allies. So it's much more calculated and much more out of the awareness that if you demonstrate that you're a generous relationship partner, well, then your relationship partners will recognize that you're a generous relationship partner, and will try to this is how alliances are built.
And this is where the reason aspect of your four pieces come in, right?
Yeah.
Where we have this ability to reason, to say, okay, if we do this and this and this and this, this is going to have a benefit for others involved and for myself, and hopefully that, pushes things to better things of sorts. It's the rational component.
We can get what we want. We can, and that notion of we can figure out what we want, and then we can reason our way to courses of action that will give us what we want, is kind of the controlling idea in the book. So we are aware, an instinct for reciprocity. The classic instinct for reciprocity is a vampire bat that will cough up part of its blood meal. It's gone out, and it's found a cow, to drink blood from, a sleeping cow, and it, fills its stomach up with that blood and comes back to the roost. And there, it has a roost mate who wasn't so lucky, didn't find anything to eat. And that roost mate demonstrates that she's hungry and comes and finds a roost mate who had a really good night of hunting. There's one that was underfed, there's one that's overfed, and the well-fed one's going to regurgitate part of her blood meal into the mouth of the hungry one. And what this ends up, this instinct appears to be regulated by reciprocity. These bats seem to have a memory of who has helped whom, and they respond, they hold these memories and then use that information to seek out individuals to help in the future. So it's this really weird thing where it's not like everyone's going around asking for favors. It's actually the opposite. People in a position to do favors go out and seek opportunities to do favors. That to me that's what an instinct for reciprocity looks like. It's like, I can't help it. Like, this is just the way my mind works. I'm out there hustling, and what I'm hustling to do is invest, So that's okay. So that's I think a very biologically useful archetype for reciprocity. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to jump in there and say, just to kind of underscore that, in Nicola's book, that's one of the powerful things about it, is that she shows from all over the animal kingdom, all other animals do this. This isn't just humans doing this, right?
That's right.
You see this in babblers. You see this in certain fish. You see this in what's the spider that kills itself so the young can live. You see this in ants. You see this in other birds. Like, this is not just a human thing. It's in different types of. Even we're talking about insects here that are having these instincts, as you're saying, to do this. And so there's the lens here is very wide in the animal kingdom. So I just want to clarify to listeners that this is not just a human thing, that this kind of instinct is for reciprocity and all these other elements of cooperation and or kindness is in the animal kingdom.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I suspect humans do have these instincts as well, but I think we also discover through just living our lives that when I do something nice for other people, they recognize that I'm the type of person who seems to have the propensity for doing nice things for them. So you can also reason your way to realizing that reciprocity is a good policy. When you have a universe of people you could be interacting with, you would want to interact with people who seem to be cool and nice and generous and take an interest in you. So I'm not sure we need an instinct for reciprocity to recognize this reality of human life. So I think reciprocity is a part of why we care for other people, but I think we also discover, I think you could teach this principle to a child who didn't necessarily have a vampire bat style instinct for reciprocal sharing. I think you could explain to them, look, if you help this person, they're going to remember that you are helpful to them. And because they want to be surrounded by people who are helpful, they are going to be willing to help you. I'm sure you could reason your way. You could boost a child's reasoning who didn't have an instinct for this.
So I agree with you. Now here's I'm going to become a little bit more abstract here of sorts, and you tell me what you think about this, but many times we care not about the action, but about the intention and motive behind it. And so where does that play in here? So I could do something nice for you. I could buy you something. I could help you out with this. I could, whatever the space is that we are doing, showing kindness, we're helping someone else. But many times people say, well, you're just doing that because you want something in return, or what's your motive here? And we're mostly concerned about this. You can make the same argument about values and morals as well. But many times, I think this is the Nietzschean argument, right? Many times what we're really asking about is the intention. And that's a deeper question, because you could help somebody. You could legitimately, you would say altruistically, fine. You could say that, but we met sometimes in certain contexts, in certain situations, and with certain people, sometimes the intention or the motive is more important. So where does that factor in here?
Well, I think that's huge. When we're evaluating other people's moral standing and deciding whether they're good or bad people, what we're trying to make is inferences about character. We want to know about beliefs and intentions. I think fundamentally, when we want to size up people's behavior, we're trying to figure out what they intended to do and what they believed. So in the realm of judging other people's moral worth, what you want to know is, when they were helping you, in the realm of sort of explaining pro-social behavior, what you want to figure out, was this a means to some other end, or is this because they have strong moral convictions that was the right thing to do, and so forth. And you want to ally yourself with people who will be helpful on the basis of character and not simply on the basis of expediency, just because that makes for a more reliable, predictable action space going forward. But you can still teach, I think, without leading your kid astray, the notion that you can just look at the payoffs. And if this is somebody who seems like a person who helps you when they have the opportunity, like that, of the infinity of people you could be interacting with, like that's one you should keep paying attention to. So and I do think that we're ultimately going to be wanting to make a character inference of some sort. So if you see that this person has other motives, you're going to want to take that into account for sure. But yeah, let me stop there.
Yeah, that's really difficult because I can think of numerous examples where someone's character, let's just say, is terribly flawed, but that doesn't mean they still don't have moments where they can help people. And that's kind of like a nice surprise. I think it's probably more of an insult to injury where, okay, there's enough signals here that tell me this person's reliable based on the confluence of all the many times they've done X, Y, and Z. And they really failed me on this one or whatever. They really, wow. I had this all figured. And so there's like a few things going on here, right? It's like, is it really necessary? I don't think it always is. Maybe I'm wrong. Second is you can have, this is a question I've struggled with in my mind for decades now, so I don't think that a person's behavior defines who a person is. I do think that there are signals to parts of a person, but I don't think it's a one-to-one where I do something and then that's me, right? I think that and that becomes tricky, right? Because it's sometimes the behavior, the words, the actions is all you have. You don't know the internal workings of a person. And yet we know this, right? We know that everyone, this is human nature of sorts, is, someone can do the worst possible things and could also potentially do some of the best things. I'll give you an example. Michael Vick was a phenomenal football player. no one can question his talent. And I'm sure he was, very nice to his family and all these things. And he did some really horrible things, right, to animals, which is, there's some question marks around that. But in some ways, this person, and many people are like this, is, they can have, I think he was involved in charities. He did a lot of good work off the field. He was a phenomenal football player. And he had a dark side to him. And he did some really horrible things. That does not, if you just looked at Mike Vick and saw he abused and tortured and killed dogs, and that was all you had based on that behavior to make a judgment about his character, I would say that that's a incomplete picture of who he is. And I think you could, that's one example, but you could make that calculus for pretty much any human being. Mm-hmm. And so that becomes difficult. And maybe I'm just looking at some of the holes or trappings of status is deceiving, because you could do something, and that is helpful. And we use our mental heuristics every day, and we need to do that. But people are very complicated, and there's a lot of nuance there. So I don't know, how do you think about some of those points?
Well, let me pivot a little bit to what we've been learning about how the mind how the mind appears to evaluate character, mm-hmm. or come to character evaluations. A lot of really, really thoughtful experimental psychologists over the past 10, 15 years or so have recognized that you can think about our evaluations of other people as a basic as a basic challenge of learning, mm-hmm. reinforcement learning. Mm-hmm. So, and they very productively modeled evaluating other people's character as a process of learning from experience. Mm-hmm. So imagine you're interacting with someone that you have no acquaintance with, mm-hmm. and you have no firsthand experience with this person. So, and yet you're going to be now interacting with this person in a series of tasks that, depending on how you behave and the other person behaves, you could be better off for the interaction, or you could be worse off. I mean, this is kind of the dilemma of social life. Mm-hmm. I can interact with you, and depending on how I treat you and you treat me, I could be better off or worse off. Mm-hmm. So you go and, we can simulate this in the laboratory. Create a situation where you're going to interact with a single stranger over and over in an experimental economics game, mm-hmm. like a game like the trust game, where you have the opportunity to share some money with this person, and then that money grows, and then they have the opportunity to return some of it to you, mm-hmm. or not. So what computational social psychologists have discovered is you can model the process of figuring out what kind of person you're dealing with as a basic process of reinforcement learning. I'm coming into that first interaction with a certain expectation. That expectation might be just, I have no expectation. The person could be absolutely horrible or absolutely wonderful. I have no idea. Or it could be based on your own learning history that you bring, mm-hmm. in.
Whatever your priors are.
What your priors are.
Bayesian kind of priors. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, precisely. Mm-hmm. You're precisely your Bayesian priors. Mm-hmm. And, you have a history of having had a lot of nice strangers that you interacted with in the past, or most of the strangers you've interacted with have been total jerks. So you'll bring that in with you.
Sure.
And then so you think of that as just a number you assign to people, on a, I don't know, scale from 0 to 10, how good of a person is this? I don't know, a 7. Mm-hmm. That's how most people in my life have behaved. Mm-hmm. Then when they treat you in more trustworthy ways than you were expecting, given that 7, mm-hmm. that comes as a surprise.
Sure.
That's not what the mind was expecting. So you take notice. The mind takes notice and says, that's kind of weird. I wonder if that was just noise. Mm-hmm. And you go back, you kind of figure that new behavior in, you put it in the back of your mind. That's slightly unusual, not expected. And if they continue to treat you better than you were expecting, that's surprising. You've been reinforced, you've more than you wanted. The mind registers that as a reward. You were predicting, you got better behavior than you were predicting. And this is going to nudge up your evaluation of the other person's character and your evaluation of their trustworthiness. Same goes in the other direction. If people treat you more poorly than you were expecting, then you adjust your assessment of their character downward. And then you get to a point where you're not surprised anymore, where they're just treating you the way you were expected. And then you've locked onto your assessment of what kind of person they were. So, our evaluations come out of just experiences of individual people. We also can build them on, before you've interacted with somebody, you don't just necessarily have to go in with your expectation for people in general. There's something really powerful you can bring to refine that blind estimate, just like that guess based on previous experience. And that's their reputation. So if you hear from somebody you value, admire, respect, that, hey, this is a good person, like you could do business with this person, person keeps her word or whatever. That's going to adjust your prior expectations up above your baseline. So we use reputation to kind of build our expectations for how this relationship is going to go. And that's going to shape our behavior. Well, I've been told this person is somebody I can trust. So I'm going to start out by making myself vulnerable. So we start with our personal learning history. Then we import what third parties have told us about what kind of people we're dealing with. And then we go through trial, in a sense, trial and error learning. And I think that's a big part of how we build character judgments, is just we look at behaviors. Now you can make more sophisticated models in which you build in intentions, and then you can discount failures to implement good intentions. You can discount bad behavior as noise on the part of the actor. The person meant to do better but couldn't. So that I think that's kind of what you want to save a place for.
Yeah. Well, 100%. I mean, I think that I agree with everything you said. I mean, it all tracks. I mean, this is a part kind of predictive analysis that we're making to try and say, okay, I'm coming in with certain priors. These are confirmed or denied, or maybe there's some noise. Maybe it's a surprise. Maybe it's a byproduct of something. All fair. I think that that can only work, or I think that only works if based on what you see and what the other person gives you.
Nice.
And and humans are terribly complicated. And there are parts about a person that they themselves don't even know that they haven't explored, that they haven't, plumbed, those depths, and they themselves may show it and see it. And then they're surprised and the other person's surprised. And so I think that predictive kind of model is true and it works. And I think it can be very helpful. I think in the complexities of different types of prosocial relationships, it becomes more and more complicated. The more and more you see on both ends. And then when it becomes a two-way kind of thing, then you're dealing with a bunch of different things there. And now there's a lot more variables going on. And so I think it's kind of what you're saying. You can factor in and out various elements of complexity of social interactions, which is interesting. I don't know if we're able to model all of that. I think that's very hard to do. I think we're really good at finding patterns, and many times I think it does confirm or deny various priors. But then there's all these other things that it's like, whoa, here's a whole other side of a person I didn't even know. Yeah. I had no idea. Well, I mean, that's not just one or two things. That's a whole other room in the house I have to explore now. Like, that's not just, and that can be, pretty difficult to kind of factor in, because then that could possibly, change all the other things already at this point, all those other heuristics we've built at that point. So it's a very interesting kind of way. But I do think that I agree with everything you said, though, that the behaviors are super important. And then that does start to give us a reliable way of understanding, well, how do we judge, in the kind of literal sense, judge the aspects of the person and their intentions and all those things. I want to ask about a few kind of terms. I've talked about it a handful of times now on the podcast, but so we have things like pity, compassion, sympathy, empathy, some nurturing. There's all these different words that are, almost synonymous at this point, right? There's so many people that have done really good research on this. And I know that there's research that's been done by a handful of folks of trying to find a kind of clear way of developing a taxonomy of these things, right? When we're talking about a distinct subjective experience, right? This is happening and I feel this inside. We call it this emotion, right? We call it this thing, right? We call that I feel empathic or, whatever. And so what we can do is a lot of the times when we're describing events or experiences, intrinsically or interpersonally, many times people will be talking about the same thing and sometimes we'll use different words, especially when you go cross-culturally. But I think what's more and more pushed for is, well, how do we have a kind of an umbrella kind of thing, right? So let's say we have compassion, right? That's the big umbrella term for these series of experiences. And sure, this is maybe sympathy and empathy, and maybe this is compassion specific, or maybe, so how do you think about how do we have, or how important is that? And where do you see that in terms of, okay, how do we understand what it is we're really talking about when someone's experiencing something and they're trying to give it a name or a label or describe that distinct experience?
Yeah, there's a temptation in psychology to multiply entities infinitely.
Yeah, we're good at that.
Yeah, and Jack Block actually referred to two fallacies. One was, I can't remember, and I don't know that anyone can. One is the jingle fallacy, and one is the jangle fallacy. Mm-hmm. Paper about these. Mm-hmm. The jingle fallacy, I think, is the fallacy that things with the same name refer to the same thing. Mm-hmm. So, you might have a measure of aggression. You've named aggression, and it refers all to, behavior, bargaining, being a hard bargainer in mm-hmm. the business context. Mm-hmm. And there might be another measure of aggression that's not only not about the business context, but it's not about behavior. It's just like someone who tends to get angry all the time. Mm-hmm. Well, those might both be called aggression, but you're just using the same name for two entirely different things in the world. Mm-hmm. And then there's the jangle fallacy, where we use, I think I've got them reversed. Doesn't mm-hmm. really matter, mm-hmm. but it's where we have one. Okay, yeah, I think I actually do have it right. We have one phenomenon that we give a variety of different names to. Mm-hmm. So an example of this, not meaning to pick on anybody. I'm sorry, Angela. Really not meaning to pick on you. But grit is an example. Angela Duckworth's concept of grit. Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting idea, provocative, gotten a lot of people to pay attention to some important individual differences. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, a psychometric analysis of measures of grit make it look like it's really just conscientiousness. It's mm-hmm. So that would be the jangle fallacy, where we sort of create a new entity mm-hmm. by naming something we already know a lot about.
And I think she's kind of admitted to that.
She has.
Source. She's kind of said, yeah, I could see that. Or I think she hasn't totally dismissed it out of hand. I think she's, but I think other people outside of her have like ran with it.
Absolutely. No. I think that's exactly how things have gone. I think she's been, quite responsible about those criticisms. I just didn't feel like going out of my way to pick on anybody.
No, I hear you.
But so anyway, with going back to your question, I think we have a tendency to create more psychological phenomena than maybe are really out there or worthy of our theorizing. But we have really, really rich emotion lexicons in the advanced world, because we have literature and we have places to place these ideas and develop them, enrich them, and reveal people's inner lives. And that's not necessarily, and so we can create emotions in a sense where such fine-grained distinctions didn't exist in a pre-literate world. So if you wanted to argue that sympathy and empathy were different, or pity and tenderness were different, well, I would say like, well, good luck. Like you can sort of stipulate, that there are these differences by sort of just philosophizing about them as being different. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those habits, those concepts in our minds contain those concepts or act on them. So I think a more productive way to try to name the animals in the zoo, the emotional zoo, is to try to identify adaptive problems that would have been well solved by a specific kind of motivational system, this sort of broadband broadcast system that we often think of as emotions. So, what kind of problem would you be happy to have an emotion of shame for? Well, that might be a situation in which you've broadly lost your social value in the light of a bunch of people you respect, and you need to, reach around and find some things you can do to reestablish your worth. That you've lost your social value through some course of action that some bad things you did. Well, you might be better off as a human if you had an emotion that caused you to reach around and try to reestablish your value. Imagine, there's, there are animals that want to get you when it's dark, during a new moon. You might want to have an emotion that's kind of like feeling creeped out, and you might call that fear, but it might be something a little bit more like it's just creepy and spooky out there, and I'd prefer to say indoors. I don't know. I think you're better, to identify adaptive problems that were recurrent features of our species' evolutionary history, and then figure out if the folk labels we're using for emotions fit well onto those adaptive pressures. Could lead you to say like, hey, this label we're using for this emotion, like I know what it's for, or you could say like, we don't have a name for that yet.
Yeah.
Sibling jealousy is like an example, there's not a special name for that, but it's like a special thing, Yeah. Like I don't want my younger brother getting stuff from my parents that I'd prefer to have for myself.
Right.
So like that's a unique adaptive problem.
Or get less punished than me because, he gets away with everything and I don't. I get punished harder because I'm older, whatever. It's just like he's always getting off easy, whatever. It's this type of jealousy specific that's not as, I absolutely agree. There's that's a good example of like, we call it sibling rivalry or sibling jealousy, and it's like its own thing, but it's not the same kind of jealousy as like when a person feels jealous about their partner or their mate being, talking to someone else that's, not their mate, it's different, right? So, and I agree with you about the shame thing too. I've been the advocate for adaptive features of shame and other emotions. I talked to Owen Flanagan recently, and he calls it his mature sense of shame, which I like that term. And I tend to lean more on universalist kinds of things because it's rooted in the evolutionary makeup of who we are in terms of, I do think that there are enough experiences that all humans have that we can call it something like that as an emotion. Where I come down on this is the expression of it might be different, but I don't think it means it's a different, and it's not something that someone creates in their mind. And so I have some pushback on the social constructionists on these things. But there are some very valid points they make as well. So I totally agree with you on that. I think finding an adaptive function rooted in evolutionary biology and psychology makes a lot of sense to understand, like, you can have some nuance here, but we're really talking about the same thing, or we're talking about this central thing that's, trying to protect us or alert us or signal something to us, whether it's very complex with social relationships or just in basic survival, I guess. So I would agree with you on that. I guess this will segue to the next part of it is, you talk about kindness and compassion of sorts. Obviously I'm sure you're familiar with Paul Bloom's work on empathy. He's the anti-empathy guy. I'm just kidding, Paul. Just kidding. I talked to him a few months ago, and we talked a little bit about his book, and it's a great book, and he's wonderful. But he strongly believes that there are some pretty big pitfalls to empathy if you're trying to use it to make decisions, and where compassion is much better to make moral decisions or just decisions in general. So in terms of that is we'll kind of just talk about here in a minute of how we've expanded our world to all these big things and these different periods of trying to help others. Would you agree with some of Paul's points on empathy, or just is there a disagreement, or what are the limits, I guess, of empathy in your mind?
Well, empathy seems to motivate helping, but we don't know what the motivation is that it activates. One of the big hypotheses that's still on the table is that when you feel empathy for someone who's suffering, it causes you to take an interest in the welfare of that person. Okay, it's called the empathy altruism hypothesis. That there is a motivation activated by empathy that's not fulfilled, that's not sated until that person in need has been made better off. So that
and that would be different. That would be different from compassion, or you're using them as synonymous.
I'd use them pretty synonymously. I'd have a hard time figuring out how to separate those.
You're caring about the well-being of someone else.
Yeah. You're feeling soft-hearted or sympathy or empathy for that other person. But empathy could do other things. It could motivate you to. It could be a signal. We just don't know. Like, it could be a signal that there are you're suddenly in a space where if you don't do things the right way, people will judge you badly. That could be what empathy is about. It's like, wow, I'm feeling empathy for this other person. I better treat them nice, or others might think less of me.
So going back to the kind of status or signaling of sorts.
Right. I mean, we're strangers to ourselves. So we may not know, it's perfectly plausible that what empathy does, like, okay, it leads you to help. Yeah. It could be that it leads you to help because there's somewhere in your mind that says, if I don't help, people are going to think I'm a big jerk.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple of different theories, but Paul, what Paul is aware of, I think, is, and correctly, is that it does cause you to focus on the person in need, which means that you tend to marginalize other considerations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm now focused on how I can do something that's going to improve your welfare. That can violate more, sort of more universal principles of justice, like fairness or first come, first served, or proportionality, utility. For example, I might, my empathy for someone might motivate me to, well, my empathy for my kids every day, causes me to provide benefits to them that are wildly, obscenely inefficient ways to make the world a better place.
Yeah, right. I think the way Paul says it is that, empathy to make this rational decisions, empathy creates a spotlight effect, and it's pretty parochial. So, why do you care about your kids, Mike? What about my kids? Okay. Like, what about my kids? And what about the next person's kids? Like, why do you care about them? And you have empathy for them more than, the kids around the world. That's not, they need empathy too. And of course, of course you're going to care about your kids more than that. It goes back to the whole kin selection thing, right? Yeah. But it's just like, that is creating, that's kind of a exaggerated example, but it does have consequences if it's like, yeah, I'm just going to help this person because, they also voted for Joe Biden. I'm not going to I'm not going to have empathy for the other guy. No way. I'm not going to do that. And so it does, in certain contexts, create this, they're from my town or from my state. Those people from Florida, I'm not going to, whatever. Right. That's not, people do that. And it does have this, people.
Hey, I'm from Florida. I spent 30 something years of my life down there, man. So watch yourself, buddy.
I have family down in Florida. It's a very warm state, and there are some nice people down there.
That is the most useless. That is the most useless statement ever made. It's a very warm state. They have some nice people. It's a very warm state. They have some nice people down there.
But it's one of those things, right? Where it's just like, well, I'm going to care. Find whatever line you want, right? Yeah. I'm going to have more empathy for someone based on nationality or religion or group or race or, interest, you name it. And so if we're just using empathy to say, well, I want to care about this person's well-being because they're similar to me or they're closer to me, it can have some pretty terrible blind spots, right? I think that's Paul's distinction is, that's a pretty bad blind spot for if you're just using empathy to guide some of those decisions.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it doesn't give you a firm place to stand in terms of how to be an efficient helper in the world, and actually how to make the world a better place. Mm-hmm. If I feel sympathy or empathy, if you like, for a given person, I'm going to try to help them to, irrespective of, what the second order effects of that are going to be in the world. Mm-hmm. So it reduces proportionality, it reduces perspective, it reduces a consideration of long-term consequences. To do good in the world sometimes means to control your empathy, control your sympathy, so that it doesn't run away from you. I mean, and this is the philanthropist's dilemma.
Yeah.
This is why so many philanthropists really prefer to stay. I don't know what the statistic is, but a large proportion of the giving in this charitable giving or philanthropic giving is done anonymously. because people don't want, I mean, first of all, they don't want people knocking on their doors all the time, or other people knowing how wealthy they are. But also they don't want their judgment clouded by, special pleas, special appeals, because they know that it will cause them to waver from the commitments that they formed, when the heads were cooler. Yeah. So I think empathy, whatever its function is, I think it's probably not a very reliable guide to how we should be acting in the world to make sentient nervous systems better off.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I talked about this with Paul, and I think you were saying in the beginning, and I agree, is empathy has a place, and it's very important. The specific here is that it should not be made for all moral decisions, because it does have some pretty poor blind spots.
That's right. Yep.
Just in the middle of the book, I just one question to pull out from here is you talk about this period, which was interesting. You call it the axial age, right? On compassion, somewhere between 800 and 200 BCE, where religion and philosophy were all going on, and the golden rule that came out of this and other things. And so tell us just kind of about this transitional period, this axial period, and how that impacted just this move into what we have seen now in modernity of, philanthropy and humanitarian aid and things like that, as a kind of a transitional period, kind of in a big scale of things into where we're at now.
Yeah, there was a psychiatrist turned sort of philosopher and humanist who was writing about the course of history. And like a lot of sort of humanistic writers, name was Karl Jaspers. And like a lot of writers kind of operating at that time, he thought he saw in history a kind of inevitable directional arrow of progress or consciousness or things going directionally in a specific way. Humans were becoming something smarter, more ethical, more creative. What's going on? This is a lot of people have kind of had this sort of progressivist notion of history. And Jaspers was no exception. What he put his finger on is a moment in time, a sort of axis, of human history, where things change suddenly and dramatically. This axial age, there, a before and after. It's not before and after the birth of Christ. It was before and after the classic world religions and philosophical systems that we still have today. Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Hindu religion, Buddhism, classical Greek thought. These are the sort of, 5, 6, 7, all coming online, sort of like 500 BCE is maybe a nice middle landmark in when all of these things, when this axial age began. And what all of these systems actually, they do have some things in common. They tend to view history as directional and not cyclical. They do tend to believe, they start to, they all kind of trade in the idea that there are forces, gods that have moral convictions and moral desires and want certain things for you, want you to behave in certain moral ways. They also they all feature a kind of unification of religion and morality. Prior to the axial age, you had gods that were just mean. The high gods were just petty, nasty, mean, vindictive, mercurial, sons of bitches. And following the axial age, there was an increasing conviction that gods were good. And or had the capacity to be moral. So you get this blending of the religious and the ethical. To be a good religious person means to behave according to certain ethical norms, treat others a certain way, fit into your society in a certain way, have a certain kind of set of virtues and so forth. One of the things all of these systems, maybe with the exception of like classical Greek thought, one of the things they have in common is the notion that, the golden rule. In one form or another, all of the axial age systems, it seems to have popped out of nowhere, all begin to trade into this idea that, look, what do you like? What causes you pleasure and pain? What are the things you would like others to do to you and not to do to you? Well, treat other people that same way. That's how we, that's how you find your right place in society. That's how you warm God's heart. That's what it means to live an ethical life, or live a life in harmony with the universe, with the true state of affairs, to win yourself a place in heaven or in God's favor. So the axial age is the golden rule. I mean, in some ways, it is about the dawn of the golden rule. And
is that coming out of basically trying to be preventative, right? Like, look, there's a lot of shit that happens, right? We have wars and famines and disease and plague and this is sort of agrarian age, and so it's a hardship, and we got to find a way to, like, just at a scale, just get better with each other. Is it coming out of that kind of problem, or is it arising, you think, for other reasons?
A researcher named Stephen Sanderson, an anthropologist, has the theory that what was happening in the axial age is urbanization and warfare, very large scale, very fatal, lots of lives lost warfare. So people are living, first of all, through urbanization, are living living in cities of tens of thousands, many tens of thousands. Increasingly cities are getting huge. And at the same time, they're being exposed through trade and stories and contacts with other individuals, other people, stories about the horrors of war. Oh, and also they're also, interacting with people from, the world's becoming a pretty cosmopolitan place through trade. You're able to meet people from all over the world, speak all kinds of different languages, different cultures, eat weird things, dress in weird ways, and yet you have to interact with them through trade. So the on Sanderson's view, we're asking questions about why humans are so cruel. We're asking questions about how do we live together among strangers, and what do we do with these people who are so different culturally, and yet we got to get along with to get the gains of trade. And so it's a combination of these factors. Sanders doesn't talk so much about trade, but I can't resist sort of putting it into the mix because I think it is important. All these things leave you with this problem, which is, how ought we be living in a world where we have such capacity for violence, and yet so many opportunities to interact with people who seem like pretty okay people. So what the golden rule is calling people to do in order to build a stable society, or to recognize that groups, the world consists of more than just the people who worship your God or speak your language, is to simply recognize that they've got feelings and preferences that are every bit as valid as yours are.
Yeah. It does seem like an element or way of, as the world is rapidly changing, rapidly for the time. I mean, it really changes fast now, but rapid for the time. and different types of calamity that it's like, well, we got to find a way to make sure people don't die as much, or people get pushed out, or, there's all these, elements with rapid change, which kind of is what the last third of the book of yours talks about, which is, you talk about this first poverty enlightenment, you talk about the humanitarian Big Bang, which is, it's this way of, we'd mentioned it earlier, all these organizations now that are trying to help folks in different parts of the world. I think you talk about the second poverty enlightenment. So, how do we, you don't have to go over all of those, but how do we get from that period to where we're at now? And then I'll ask you about the effective altruism movement, because that's kind of another wave, if you will, or it's a more recent wave coming out of that. So how do we get from the axial age all the way through modernity and the agrarian age, and then obviously now to the digital technical age of how we're doing things?
Yeah, you pointed to the fact that, and we spoke earlier about the fact that reason has been a big part of how our concern for strangers has evolved. And I think that's right. Starting in the axial age, one of the things I think people realize is there is actually a reason to treat others well, which is that in a world of golden rule followers, they're expecting you to treat them that way. Mm-hmm. And if you fail to treat them that way, then that kind of invalidates your claim to special consideration from them. So the golden rule is a reason for treating strangers well, because you'd want strangers to treat you well. So this is kind of the beginnings of, philosophical ethics. And so a very utilitarian ethic, in as much as you want to demand a certain kind of treatment from people, they're going to recognize your rationality by the fact that you are willing to extend the same kind of concern for them. Mm-hmm. So reasoning straight from the axial age starts to discipline how we think about the welfare of strangers. And you just see this proliferating through the axial age world. Axial age Judaism, hospitals, hostels for strangers, schools for children, orphanages, organizations that raise dowries for widows or for orphan children. These are the first institutions for public welfare and public health, I think, not coincidentally coming out of a recognition of sort of golden rule reasoning. So you're right, the last half to 2/3 of the book is really about tracing calamities, large-scale mass confrontations, society-wide confrontations with mass disaster or mass suffering that caused society's thinkers, writers, politicians to ask, how do we solve this problem, which is causing all of us problems? Mm-hmm. And what ultimately comes out of those deliberations about what should we do to deal with this particular kind of suffering and second order problems it creates for us is, well, we should figure out some creative ways to help these people.
Yeah, because there's a kind of, as the world, and you can definitely see this now through globalization, the world's just connected. It's just hyperlinked together. And so what happens is that what affects you and me can just as easily affect someone else around the world, much more easily than it did, 6,000 years ago, right?
For sure.
It's just more connected. And so when things are connected, there's a downside of that is that, well, when it starts to have a problems in one area, well, it starts to kind of bleed out into other areas of the web, of connectedness with people and nation states and things like that. And you can, in the modern era, look at various refugees and migration and things like that. It's like, whoa, like this is now one area of the world is being impacted by another area of the world, which is now being impacted economically, which is being impacted. Like, it just, you start to see, like, with that comes more problems. And so then it is, because of what you're saying, our rationality is to say, wait a minute, well, how do we take care of each other so we're all not affected and help those in need? Totally.
Yes, exactly. And probably the the best example of how these second order effects stack up and lead you to try to help people in need is what was going on in 16th century Europe, first quarter of the 1500s. Famine. It was cold. It was unusually cold time. Famine was rife. There'd been a lot of wars, leaving a lot of war veterans, and people were just roaming. Poor people were roaming from city to city, looking to find a better life. And what they were bringing to the big cities of Europe was poverty and disease and lack of skill. People without work skills, without social capital, who were hungry and diseased. And they were showing up at the city gates and dying in droves during some very cold winters. This was happening. You pick your large European city, and the stories are the same. So, what this led to was, in ultimately something like 50 large cities in European cities, was a sort of effort to rationalize charitable giving. And up until then, all organized charitable giving was, and really all outreach to the poor was sort of organized by the church.
Is it alms, give alms to the poor, all that stuff?
Yeah. And then, food, clothing, shelter, that was largely distributed through the church.
They still do that today, actually.
They still do that today. Imagine a world in which almost all care for the poor was channeled through that. That's how it was until about 1525, when, following the writings of a humanist named Vivus, who made a case to the city senate of Bruges that they needed to turn over all of the existing religious charities and their resources to the state, to the city, for control, for rationalization of all of these, charitable guilds and organizations and efforts, so as to create efficiencies, and so as to actually focus on getting outcomes, actually getting stuff done, actually solving the problem of alcoholics in the streets, or petty crime, or epidemic, these problems that we can't control, social unrest. And Vivus's idea was, we need to count these people. I mean, they sound incredibly modern now, and we still have to say them out loud to remember, oh yeah, we need to do these things. You want to know how many poor people there are, or people living unhoused? Well, you got to count them first. Do you want to help them? Well, you need to figure out what they lack in order to become productive, self-sufficient. Vivus was arguing for all of these things, and ultimately that concept was adopted. The notion that the state needs to get involved in minding its own problems with suffering and well-being. It wasn't just families that need to take an interest in it. Wasn't just the church, because the effects extend through the entire city. So this was like reasoning in action. What are we going to do? What are we going to do with all these poor people? What do we do with all these sick people? Well, we need to count, we need to measure, we need to develop interventions, and we need to evaluate the interventions.
And the sobering truth to this is that we're still doing that in many modern societies now. We're still trying to figure out we debate this, right? How much does the state have their involvement in helping folks that are disenfranchised or have need or have want, and people are still trying to figure that out in certain ways in the modern era. I guess the one of the last questions I have is is about the effective altruism movement. I think Will McCaskill is pretty big on this. I think it has some origins in Peter Singer's work. I think it has, there's a few other, I think Toby Ord is one of these guys connected. There's a few guys that are doing this stuff, effective altruism. There's other people I can't remember. What do you think about that movement? How it works and kind of the future of where we have compassion for others and kindness for others individually and then kind of at a big scale level.
Yeah, I think the effective altruism, the reasoning on which it was built is pretty fascinating. Mm-hmm. If we can all stipulate that suffering is bad, it's morally bad, mm-hmm. and that if it's in your power to do something to alleviate it, that's morally good. And the more of it you alleviate, the more moral goodness you're doing, then anytime you're not doing as much as you could to alleviate suffering, up to the point where you're creating that same amount of suffering by depriving some other good cause those resources, then you're not doing enough good in the world. You're not being as morally good as you could be and should be. It's morally wrong not to alleviate suffering, net suffering, whenever you can. It's a pretty, and that's Peter Singer's argument, mm-hmm. From the 1970s.
Yeah.
That has kind of formed the basis of this movement called the effective altruism movement. And it's really based on this idea that suffering is bad, alleviating it is morally bad, alleviating it is morally good. So your job as someone who wants to do the most good in the world, to be the most moral person in the world, is to figure out for every dollar, of income or hour of, time you want to invest, how to reduce the most suffering with it. Mm-hmm. So this has driven a lot of philanthropists, large foundations, Gates Foundation as an example, mm-hmm. To really look carefully at their investments, their philanthropic investments, with an eye toward figuring out how do we relieve the most suffering as possible when we give a dollar, when we give a dollar of our payouts. So it's become pretty sophisticated. It's become a data-based movement. It's not just for the big philanthropies either. The effective altruism movement is something that a lot of individuals have gotten caught up in.
Yeah.
And they tend to be people who are sensitive to data, mm-hmm. who realize that there are trade-offs. A good bottle of scotch is something good. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to forego a bottle of, scotch in order to do some good in the world, it should at least do as much good as that bottle of scotch would have done you, right. And it's not a guarantee actually that, $80 of philanthropy. I don't know what you like to drink, but I'm good.
It depends on who's buying, but it's $150, $200 bottle is delicious, but I'm not spending that kind of money on a monthly basis though either.
No. I'm not either. I'd be happy with a lot less than that. But that's, you can have a lot, you can have a pretty good time on, with a $100 bottle of scotch. There's no guarantee you're going to get that much good time, create that much good times for other people with $100 philanthropic investment. Mm-hmm. For a lot of nonprofits or, philanthropic organizations, $100 would just be throwing it down the hole because they're not going to use it efficiently, or they're going to, mm-hmm. efficiently in this, not in the sense that they are crappy with their money, right. but that the money they're using simply isn't generating outcomes.
Right.
So someone who's taking this effective altruism idea seriously is going to say, if I give this organization $100, do we know how much good it's going to do in the world? Mm-hmm. And for most charitable organizations right now, there is no good data. They mm-hmm. They do not have good effectiveness data. And for the ones where we do have good effectiveness data, the conclusions for where you ought to be putting your money are actually pretty boring. I looked
Yes.
these up. I looked
Yes.
these up the other day because I was teaching this stuff in my social psychology class. Like 4 out of the top 5 are about reducing infectious diseases around the world.
It's like buying nets for helping people not get bit by mosquitoes. So it's like, well, it's that's not very sexy, but that's super effective. And if you're just doing a once in a while donation of $100, that's not effective either. It has to be a kind of continuous kind of cycle of how, so there's a reliability there, so they can use the money reliably to have the supplies that are needed to prevent things like mosquito bites from infecting people.
Yeah, or roundworm
Right,
infections.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a big cause of stunted growth, stunted intellectual development, that has effects that we can measure out to adulthood in terms of earning capacity and amount of education received. So simple deworming medications for little school kids. It's like a nickel or something a dose. I mean, you can deworm a kid for very little money, and because that kid is then not excreting worm. Sorry, everybody. Worm infected poop. Other people won't get it as well. So there are these second order effects of helping that one child. So it's not sexy. It's actually kind of gross, but it's got good effectiveness data for it.
Yeah, and again, that's the thing. That is, if you're making good rational decisions based on compassion, in a way that is, well, what's the best good I can do? It's not, well, what makes me feel great. Right. I see the kid on TV late at night and he's, got some deformity, and I gave, $5 to UNICEF and I feel better. Well, you're going to feel better, but that doesn't really help in the long run. And so it's
it might help. I mean, it's going to help.
Yeah, it might help, but I mean, it's not at a mass scale for the things that are needed. And individuals, kind of what the idea is that if you're doing it at very concentrated areas for very specific things that are necessary on a continuous schedule of sorts of doing that, that's going to maximize the most ways of being helpful, is my understanding.
Well, okay, so if I'm giving to the Shriners, after they're following one of their late night commercials, the $5 a month I give isn't going to prevent a single kid from getting deformities. But that's the case even if I'm giving money to help deworming the world by medicine for kids to help deworm them. It's going to be by combining my money with other people's money, in both cases. And you're bound to do some good when you give from to an organization that pulls your heartstrings. Not necessarily. You're right. Not necessarily. But the question, is the effective altruist's question is, there's lots of places to do good. So where can I do the most good?
Yeah.
So that's where they want to go. Now, not every one of us is built like Peter Singer, I don't think, right. I think if we're trying to be, realists about how to make the world better off, it's not going to be by, getting everybody to take Peter Singer's ethics class at Princeton. It's going to be through some combination of, pulling on their headstrings and pulling on their heartstrings. Josh Green at Harvard has developed an initiative to encourage people to give. It's a website. I really wish I could remember the URL for it. Do you have like a website where you put
after I put in the notes
after episode notes? I'll find it for you if you're interested. But what he tries to do is encourage people to come over and have a look and make gifts through the website to charities they care about, like to the Shriners or something like that. But then to give devote some proportion of their giving over to effective charities that have been evaluated. And what Josh is doing is he's found a set of anonymous effective altruists who match that money. They
Interesting.
match the money that people direct over to the effective causes.
Very interesting.
So Josh calls it splitting.
Yeah.
And he finds that they've actually done research on this, that if you ask people to split, they will give more in total, and obviously they'll give more to the effective charities. So I think that's a nice middle ground there that assumes people can be more effective, but also meets people where they're at and doesn't assume you have to get on the train by being a perfect giver.
Yeah, well, I mean, Singer's great. I have disagreements with him on things, and I like $80 bottle of scotch. So I mean,
well, that's the thing. Those are things worth having. And
right? Yeah. I mean,
none of us is gonna be perfect. And not only that, but you go back to the example of kin, and your relatives. Like, there would be something deforming to children's development if we didn't favor our own children.
Yeah, of course. And
so there's a good there. Humans were built to thrive in a world where they were the apples of their parents' eyes. So there are parts about being human that rest on us not being perfectly effective altruists, I think.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Well, look, Michael, I mean, you've been generous with your time, and this has been such a fabulous conversation. I'm so happy we were able to have it. The award-winning book is called "The Kindness of Strangers: How a Selfish Ape Invented a New Moral Code." When's this coming out in softback or whatever it is, soft cover or whatever? Do you know? Yeah, is there a date?
It's not clear. I don't have a date yet.
Not clear. Okay.
Yeah.
Where can people find this book, and where can they find you and all your research?
You can find that book at your local online bookseller, worldwide. I have my website's michael/mccullough.net, and rather com.com. And you can find me on Twitter, tweeting from time to time at ME_McCullough. Those are probably the best places to see what I'm up to.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Michael, this was so much fun. I'm super grateful for you coming on and sharing all of your wisdom and knowledge and your honesty and all of your really hard work. I just can't say enough thanks to you.
Thank you. It was really stimulating to talk with you. Enjoyed it. See, the time went really quickly.
It always does. All righty. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Take care.